Hi, I'm Andrea Ferris, President and CEO of Longevity Foundation, and thank you for joining us today for our one-on-one conversation with Dr. Avi Spira, who is the global head of Johnson & Johnson's Lung Cancer Initiative. And Avi, no offense, but in my mind, more importantly, one of the founding members of Longevity's Scientific Advisory Board. So thank you for joining us, and Avi, thank you for being here and for answering our questions.
My pleasure. Very, very excited to talk to you, Andrea.
Excellent. So Avi, before we get started, would you mind just telling everybody a little bit about yourself, where you came from, how you ended up in lung cancer, and how you ended up at Johnson & Johnson doing this very important work?
I'd be glad to. So I'm a humble Canadian. I started off in Montreal, Canada, where I grew up doing my medical school training and then my residency in internal medicine. I came to the United States and Boston specifically in the late 1990s to do a pulmonary and critical care fellowship, after which I did additional training in bioinformatics and then came on faculty at BU in 2004. And I've been on faculty there for almost 15 years. About 2 years ago now, Johnson & Johnson came knocking with a very unique opportunity to lead a new cross-sector initiative to prevent, intercept, and cure lung cancer. And so I joined J&J about 2.5 years ago now.
That's excellent. And so, Avi, we've known each other for a long time now, going 10, 11 years almost, I guess. And, when we started and we first met, it really was all about finding lung cancer early and early detection of lung cancer. And then now, things have morphed into interception, which is hugely exciting also. And so I was just wondering, could you just talk a little bit both about advancements in early detection, as well as then maybe explaining a little bit about interception and what it is for people? Because it's a tremendously exciting area. And as you know, and you're heading it with Longevity, we made our biggest investment in this area with the Stand Up to Cancer Dream Team.
Let me start with early detection, as you said, which has been exciting for a while. And there have been some very significant advances that I want to make sure we get out there today. So number one, we now know definitively in the last 10 years that imaging of the chest is an effective way to screen for lung cancer and reduce the mortality from lung cancer. So specifically in folks above a certain age with a certain history of tobacco smoke exposure, we know that having an annual CT scan of the chest effectively reduces mortality from lung cancer by a significant amount. And that's both clinical trials here in the United States and now a trial coming out of Europe. So that now has become the standard of care in this country for screening for the disease and early detection. Adoption remains a significant challenge. And this is pre-COVID, so this is adoption prior to the pandemic's interruption. What I'll also say, what remains challenging and still evolving on the early detection front is what to do with the high false positive rate of CT screening. A lot of findings on those scans that are not lung cancer and how we distinguish them from early stage lung cancer. So the field of machine learning of imaging features that are predictive of cancer, molecular biomarkers, both in the blood and airway. These are exciting new developments in the last few years that have added to CT imaging for screening for lung cancer. I'd say a second challenge for CT screening is upstream of the scan. How to identify who's at elevated risk to undergo the screening in the first place. I mentioned today we use age and tobacco smoking history. The reality is there are better ways to predict who's at risk. And we are working now, there's new biomarkers that are evolving, both imaging-based and molecularly based biomarkers that can be predictive of future risk of lung cancer that we might be able to use to identify who should be screened with CT scans in the first place. So that's on the early detection front, very exciting developments and already impacting the standard of care. Interception is a newer concept that most patients who develop lung cancer incubate a pre-lung cancer process for years, maybe even decades, before they develop full-blown invasive lung cancer that presents to a clinician. So there's a big window, a huge opportunity to intervene in that pre-malignant, pre-cancer incubating space and prevent someone from getting full-blown disease in the first place. Now, today we only start treating lung cancer once you are diagnosed with early or late stage disease, but tomorrow we believe in the possibility that we'll have interventions, drugs, devices that will prevent you from getting full-blown disease in the first place. And the analog here is if you look at cardiovascular disease, 30, 40 years ago, we used to wait for someone to have a stroke or heart attack before we started treating them. Today, we don't do that. We start treating them years and decades before they get full-blown disease by treating their cholesterol. I think you're going to see a very similar paradigm shift in how we intervene in lung cancer. And we're going to wonder, 40 years from now, how did we wait till someone actually had invasive lung cancer to start treating?
I imagine with the interception too, a lot of the work that you're doing at Johnson & Johnson through the Lung Cancer Initiative is helping to move that forward as well. What kind of work are you doing there, or is Johnson & Johnson investing in?
Yeah, no, so J&J is making significant investments alongside Longevity, Stand Up to Cancer, the NCI now, to help fund the collection of cohorts, or the assembly of cohorts of folks with pre-malignant lung lesions, where we can sample the lesion and do the molecular profiling. So there, Johnson & Johnson is providing a lot of support and partnering with academic medical centers to do that. In addition, J&J is bringing some of its own internal, unique scientific expertise to some of those molecular profiling tools that are being applied to the pre-malignant samples. So we're actually seeing some of those analyses happen within the walls of Johnson & Johnson. And obviously, most importantly, what J&J brings to the table is once we've identified a target in the pre-cancer that we want to go after to prevent fully blown disease, Johnson & Johnson can help develop that drug. That's what they do best, and that's something that they are actively working on today.
Can I just pivot back to the screening for a second? You talk about screening, and as you know, we invest millions of dollars in your work as well on identifying biomarkers of risk, identifying biomarkers of recurrence. Right now, though, too, we are very focused on ensuring and helping to ensure that people who are eligible for CT screening, because that's really all we have right now, get the screening. And so a couple questions for you is, one, what impact did you see from COVID-19 pandemic on screening rates? Because a lot of times, people didn't want to go in, everybody stayed away from hospitals, and will that impact things, and how do we help to reverse that? And then more importantly, irrespective of the COVID-19 pandemic, how do we help to encourage more people to get screening? I think part of it, from my perspective and from what we see, is it's not so much a stigma of smoking, it's a stigma of nihilism that exists with lung cancer, where people don't know the incredible advancements that have happened over the last 5-10 years. Certainly since you and I have met, it's just been incredible, the pace with which things have changed. And so I think that we need to get the message out there that finding lung cancer early can save your life, and that it's really hugely important. There are things that people can do about lung cancer now. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
No, great question. And let me tackle it in two parts. Let me start put COVID aside, which is hard to do today, but let's just imagine a world without COVID for a minute, or imagine a world from 9-10 months ago. Even then, lung cancer screening was challenged in terms of adoption. And I think it is due, at least in part, to some of the reasons that you're suggesting, Andrea. The idea that there's a stigma around those that are diagnosed with lung cancer. There's certainly a cynicism around outcome, because that's historically been true. Yeah. But if you look in the last 5 to 10 years and seeing the improvements in survival and mortality in late stage lung cancer, yeah, with the new drugs, the targeted drugs, the immunotherapies, I completely agree. That is something we need to be absolutely getting out into the community. And maybe more importantly, the idea, if we catch early lung cancer, which is the goal of CT screening, survival rates can be very, very high in early stage disease. Yep. With surgery, with neoadjuvant treatment. So I think part of it is how we message to the community about the improvements we have in managing lung cancer. And part of it is destigmatizing those that are at risk, and ensuring that those at risk have access, easy access to CT screening, which is another huge problem in many parts of this country. But I think, COVID has introduced yet another challenge to screening for cancer in general and lung cancer screening in particular. In the last 6 months, I just saw some data the other day that lung, colorectal, breast, cervical cancer screening rates in the United States have dropped precipitously all over the country. And it makes a lot of sense. Folks are not going to see their primary care physicians. They're afraid to go to the hospitals. And the projections are that's going to continue for months and potentially years to come. The impact of that will be devastating on the cancer community.
Wow.
We will be diagnosing those cancers for years to come at later stages with poorer survivals. This is going to be one of the silent killers from this pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic itself carries risk, but once this pandemic is gone, if we lose the momentum on screening for cancer, the long-term implications are significant. And let me just give you one anecdote, if you wish, that I heard from Laura Esserman at UCSF, a breast cancer surgeon. I believe it was at an AACR COVID and cancer task force that I was on, where she showed data that if you're a 50-year-old woman at average risk for breast cancer, and you're supposed to go for your mammogram, you're 200 to 300 times more likely to find an early stage breast cancer on that visit than you are to catch COVID from going to the hospital. So it's also understanding or helping our patients understand the risk-benefit ratio of being screened even during a pandemic, so that the message has to get out. Go to the hospital safely, do the social distancing, wear the mask, but get screened for cancers. And specifically, those at risk for lung cancer should be screened by CT scan.
That's a very important message. Very important message. So just sticking on the screening for a second, this is more of a curiosity question on my part, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So the guidelines are in a very high risk population, but as you and I know, only 15% of people diagnosed with lung cancer fit into that criteria. So what do we do for the other 85%? And how do we expand the screening guidelines? Or do you think that that's really going to be related to the development of biomarkers for risk that could look at maybe family history or other indicators? But what do we do so that more people can ultimately be found early, have their diseases found early? What do we do for that? And what do you see on the horizon?
Yeah. So I think this is a critical issue. And today, what I see, and I'll talk about tomorrow, today what I see happening is expanding the age and tobacco smoking histories that are currently being used. So recently, the US Preventive Service Task Force came out with a broader set of criteria for allowing more inclusive criteria for trying to capture more of that population that you're referring to, Andrea, that today we miss with CT screening. So that's going to capture a slightly larger piece of the pie, but still miss a significant number of people at risk for lung cancer. So where I think we need to go tomorrow is exactly that, developing molecular biomarkers, other parts of the medical history that perhaps tailor or personalize the decision around screening to the individual, rather than simply your age and your tobacco smoking history. We know risk of lung cancer varies from individual with the same age and same history of exposure. And so we need better ways to personalize that risk and identify who truly would benefit from CT screening. And I think you are beginning to see the science evolve in this space, and you will be seeing biomarkers that can do this in the near future.
Can you define near future? I mean, is near future, I know it's not next year, but it could be
in the next 5 years, Andrea. I think realistically, there will be, we know liquid biopsies are coming across numerous cancer types for early detection, including lung. We know that there are autoantibodies that can be measured in blood. We know there are things being looked at in exhaled breath. We also know there are things that can be measured in the medical history, as you pointed out. And being able to merge those or integrate those various features, clinical factors, imaging factors, molecular factors together to personalize a risk, a 3-year risk, a 5-year risk, whatever it is of lung cancer, is, I think, where we will land in the next 5 years to improve who undergoes CT screening in the first place.
And is there research going on to look at those things now?
There are actually a number of longitudinal cohorts that have been assembled, not just here in the US, but in Europe and in Asia, where folks are collecting that information over time on at-risk individuals. The challenge is those studies take years to read out, since you need to follow those patients until some of them go on and develop lung cancer. But those are studies that are ongoing and that will read out within the next 5 years and provide us with some of that information about personalizing future risk of lung cancer.
That's hugely exciting. A question for you then. And I'll break it into three parts. What are you most excited about from a research perspective? And not just of the what's possible, but where there's active research going on in the early detection space, in the sort of, I'll call it early stage disease space. So that could be adjuvant, neoadjuvant, or preventive, chemopreventive, or interception space. And then also in the late stage disease, because we are seeing huge improvements there. We saw that in the American Cancer Society's report that came out this year of, the improvement in outcomes largely due to the targeted therapies. So in each of those three, what are you most excited about?
Yeah, I'm actually most excited about all three. Let me start, I'll go backwards. Let me start in late stage disease, because we're still seeing a lot of patients today being diagnosed at stage 3, stage 4,
Sure.
where we can't do surgery. But to your point, in the last 5 to 10 years, unimaginable advances in medically treating late stage or advanced stage lung cancer, specifically targeted therapy. What we can do for those with a mutation that's actionable is remarkable in late stage disease. The next generation of drugs that are being developed in that space, less toxic, more effective, less resistance, remarkable. And even more remarkable is what's going on in the last 5 years with immunotherapy, harnessing a patient's own immune system to go after an advanced stage tumor and see durable responses, years, durable responses in a subset of patients that are treated with these immune activating agents is really nothing short of remarkable. So I am incredibly excited. What am I excited about next? Combinations in that space. I think what you're going to begin to see are combining different forms of immune activating agents to make them even more powerful, even longer responses, and a larger fraction of people responding. Biomarkers that are better predicting who's going to respond to those agents. So I think you're absolutely going to be seeing that in the kind. I'm very, very excited about that. And new agents, I should add. Our understanding of the biology of late-stage lung cancer continues to evolve. Different ways to activate the immune system are coming beyond the PD-1 and CTLA-4 agents that we have today. If you now move into folks with early-stage lung cancer, what excites me the most about our management there is we are getting less invasive and more effective. By that I mean, if you look at what's happened on the surgical sciences side, we've gone from an open incision to take out a large amount of lung tissue to minimal incisions now through thoracoscopy and ultimately robotic surgery that's coming. So you have a very small incision, a very precise resection of the tumor, and in real time, intraoperatively, seeing where the tumor is, which is remarkable scientifically. Those are advances that we're seeing today and we're about to see tomorrow that are going to make surgery even more effective at treating the earliest stages of this disease. But in addition to that, what's perhaps even more exciting for me is endoluminal approaches, where you don't even make an incision through the chest wall, but go through the nose or mouth, Andrea, with a scope, a fiber optic scope, so-called bronchoscope, but not your father's bronchoscope. The next generation of bronchoscopes that are robotic, that can go much further out, access lesions that are much more deeply in your lung tissue, and not only diagnose them early, but deliver treatment and perhaps be more effective and more precise at treating early and pre-malignant lesions. So I'm very, very excited about where that field will evolve in the coming next 3 to 5 years. You then go all the way to early detection, sort of to folks who are at risk. What excites me most there are machine learning algorithms, so AI, artificial intelligence, in looking at patterns in data, both imaging data and molecular data, to identify who's truly at highest risk for future lung cancer development and integrating those various data forms. So I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's going to be a single thing you measure in your blood or something swabbed out of your nose or something in your medical history alone that's going to be the best predictor of future lung cancer. It's going to be the integration of all of the above through machine learning. And AI and machine learning are advancing at incredible pace. And I do think in the next 5 years, you're going to see better ways at personalizing future risk of disease.
That's amazing. So, but like with AI, there has to be the data for the artificial intelligence to be able to develop those algorithms on, right?
Yes.
And would you say, let me ask the question differently. What can patients do to help to accelerate that? We hear, can share your data, share your data. What does that mean? And who do you share it with? What data? Is it your tissue? Is it your EHR? Like what data and where?
Yeah, no, great question and an important one. I think it's all of the above. So we need, as I mentioned earlier, cohorts of individuals who are being followed longitudinally, where we know their outcomes, who got cancer and who didn't. And we also know a lot about their medical history. Where possible, we get some biospecimens like blood, nose, exhaled breath, and we can then merge all of that together and over time, again, we're following those patients over time and identify what's the best way of predicting a future risk of disease. So for patients, for members of the community, being part of those cohorts, making your medical record data available to those studies, being willing to have those biospecimens collected longitudinally, a blood sample every year, maybe a nasal swab every couple of years, I think becomes incredibly important. And again, having the wherewithal to be followed for many years, involved in the study over time, which is not easy. And it's a major commitment of time. But I think it's an important investment that patients have to make if we're going to get access, to your point, to the data that's needed for these AI and machine learning algorithms to be successful.
Well, I think it's really interesting, listening to you talk also, just it really is an ecosystem, right? In terms of no one group can solve this on their own. You have the researchers, you have the pharmaceutical companies, the diagnostic companies, but really at the crux of all of it, I think you have the patients who need to be engaged and involved. Obviously, participating in clinical trials is hugely important, but there's also a lot that people can do outside of that to help move this forward faster, to help not only themselves, but future generations of people diagnosed with lung cancer also.
100%, Andrea. I'm glad you raised that because this requires a coalition of the willing, I'll call it,
Yeah.
right? Where it is not going to be, this is a huge lift. Lung cancer is a complicated disease. To get to the vision I just laid out, we're going to need not only industry like J&J investing in this space, but governments, foundations like Longevity and Stand Up to Cancer, academic partnerships where real innovation occurs, small biotechs where they're incredibly innovative as well. We also need the patients, both to be involved in these studies and be willing to share their data, but also to advocate and ensure that the other partners come to the table. Foundations like yours, Andrea, the NCI, NIH, governments, payers, quite frankly, in terms of reimbursement for some of these tests, be they biomarkers, be they screening. So I just think this really does require a coalition, and no one can do this lift on their own.
No, and I think, especially in today's environment, in today's day and age, I think we're also really recognizing the role that community oncology centers and community oncologists play, community-based organizations, because it's not just going to your traditional academic centers anymore. I really think that in order to make sure that everyone is represented and that all people have access to optimal care, we really need to start engaging all people in this endeavor to move it forward as well. And I know you're a strong believer in that.
And I think that's one of the critical gaps today. If you look at a lot of the clinical trials, Andrea, you know better than most, often involve major academic medical centers, which is great. But reaching out to community medical centers where most care today is offered in the United States. We absolutely need to be inclusive. We need to make sure there's diversity of the patient population, that lower socioeconomic groups have access to enrolling into the trials. Only then will we know that the results are truly generalizable to the population.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so to that point, Avi, and maybe this is more a question to Avi Spira, clinician, rather than Avi Spira, researcher or J&J executive, but most people don't have access to the large academic centers. So from your perspective, both today and then maybe a few years out, what do you recommend for people in terms of accessing optimal care? At Longevity, we advocate for everybody to get comprehensive biomarker testing at a minimum, right? To ask about clinical trials at a minimum. But from your perspective, how can people who are either getting screening, that they adhere to this screening, if they're diagnosed with lung cancer, what are some of the questions that they should ask? What should they be aware of? And how, from a surgical perspective, I imagine, and one thing that we advocate for is that you go to a thoracic surgeon, not to a general surgeon. But there are a number of things. I'm just wondering, sort of, what are your top
Yeah.
3 or 5 advice points to people?
Great question, Andrea. And this is a major issue in the disparity in care for lung cancer patients. That's very clear across this country. So number one, I would advise patients to educate themselves about the options available. Wherever you live in this country, you'll have internet access.
Yep.
There are foundations like Longevity that provide amazing, phenomenal information to patients about their disease. So patients, I think, first and foremost, have to gain that information, educate themselves to know what are the options that are available out there. That's the most important thing. Number
Yeah.
two is to advocate for yourself. After you have that information, ensure that you are getting the thoracic surgeon, not the general surgeon. Ensure you're getting a thoracic surgeon who's done these types of operations for lung cancer with good outcomes. So making sure you're not just satisfied by whoever's nearby, but you're
Right.
willing to advocate for yourself to get the second opinion, to go a little bit further out of your comfort zone, to access someone where the care may be more appropriate to what you know is available out there based on, part one, learning what are the options out there. I think third, and this is interesting, Andrea, because I think this is a positive byproduct of the pandemic with COVID, is the idea that telemedicine is
Yeah.
exploding. So where you live and access to care is changing in real time now in a good way. We've seen, for example, in our hospital as a clinician, that we've gone from about 5% telemedicine visits for my pulmonary practice at Boston Medical Center to now somewhere like 95%. And even after the pandemic's gone, which is hopefully soon,
Right.
we anticipate that telemedicine will remain very, very high. It's convenient for patients, convenient for physicians, and there's a lot you can do remotely. You can share imaging, you can share pathology. So to your point, Andrea, there's no reason that any patient anywhere in the United States today cannot access the best physicians via telemedicine to share their imaging, share their pathology, get a second opinion, get guidance on their care. And that would be the third thing I'd really advise patients to look into. You don't have to be there in person. That's one of the gifts this pandemic has given the healthcare system, teaching us what we can do at a distance.
Yeah, no, that's very good advice. And I hope that everybody listens to that as well. And, you're one of the most optimistic people that I know. So I have to ask you, Avi, what are you most hopeful for over the next few years?
Yeah, I am a relentless optimist. And, the old saying, optimists and pessimists die the same way, they just live differently. So, but I think in this case, the optimism is really warranted. If you
Yeah.
look at the last 10 years and say, could anyone have imagined that we'd be where we are today with lung cancer? The answer would be no. That
Right.
optimism would have felt to be a little bit naive. So it's almost impossible to be overly optimistic about the next 10 years and what we could do, specifically in early detection. I do believe in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see a major shift in the stage at which we diagnose lung cancer. We're beginning to see it, still early days, but I do believe as we get better at identifying who should be screened in the first place and managing all the findings on the CT scans that are done, we're going to begin to diagnose people more often at stage 1 and sometimes at a precancerous stage. Number 2, I do think we're going to get much better, even better than we are today, at treating early stage and late stage lung cancer. Early stage lung cancer, we should be able to cure by pairing surgery and minimally invasive, more precise surgery with drugs, sort of the neoadjuvant idea, which I think is very, very powerful. And for late stage disease patients, I do believe cure is possible. I do believe we can have durable, prolonged responses that combine either targeted therapy or immunotherapy and really personalize the treatment to that patient's tumor. So I'm actually very, very excited really about all the phases. And I think, we could in the not too distant future really see a significant change in the 5-year survival rates for this disease.
That is awesome. That's a really great way to, I think, end our one-on-one, because I do think that it's possible. And, obviously we share the enthusiasm with you.
As science evolves, as we get better on all the fronts I mentioned, And as
Yeah.
advocacy gets even stronger, as I said, my optimism is huge here.